Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the last lecture, we discussed about the different organelles of the cell. We discussed the nucleus, the cytoplasmic organelles, the functions, their compositions, and their biochemical functions related to the different types of diseases. Today, we are going to discuss as we have completed all the organelles and their functions. Now we are going to move towards the very important component of the cell, which is the biological membrane. We are going to discuss about the structure and the function of biological membrane. Biological membrane is basically surrounded by a cell membrane and a plasma or a cell membrane. It acts as a permeability barrier. Permeability barriers means it allows some of the biomolecules to pass through it according to the necessity of the cell. It is 7 to 10 nanometer wide. It separates the cell contents from the outer environment. It also provides the cellular recognition and communication. Different eukaryotic cells contain many internal membrane systems that surrounds the cell organelles. So each internal membrane system is specialized to assist in the function of organelle it surrounds. But here we are going to talk about the biological membrane. So membranes are basically the permeability barrier. So if it's a permeability barrier, it must separate the cell contents from the outer environment. So it permits the selective exchange of certain substances between the intracellular spaces. To talk about the exact chemical composition of the membrane, we know from the very basic knowledge of science, the cell membrane is composed of lipids, the proteins, and the carbohydrates. Carbohydrates can be covalently attached to the proteins and lipids. So they are the conjugated carbohydrates. They are present in the cell in relation with the lipids and protein. When if you're gonna talk about the exact percentages of these different biomolecules, so lipids composed of 40% of the cell membrane, proteins composed of the 60%, and carbohydrates is 1%. So all the carbohydrates covalently attached to the proteins or the lipids. To talk about individually the different chemical compositions, if we talk about different organelles, so plasma membranes, in the nuclear membrane, the content of lipid would be 35%. So it varies according to the different organelles. Like in endoplasmic reticulum, it could be 44%. So it is around 40% of the lipid content. When we talk about the proteins, the outer membrane of the mitochondrial contains about 52% of proteins. So it is not exactly 60%. It is round of 60%. And when we talk about the different types of proteins, in case of endoplasmic reticulum, it could be 54%, and in inner mitochondrial membrane it could be 76%. So it is these are the round figures, round percentages, which could vary in different organelles. So what are lipids? This is the basic structure of the membrane. Here you can see the different carbohydrate chains, the proteins, the lipids. So lipid is the outer covering. Lipid make the like you already know that lipids have a polar head, which is hydrophilic in nature, and a non-polar tails, which are hydrophobic in nature. So lipid molecules have a polar or ionic head, therefore they are hydrophilic, and the other end, which is non-polar, they are hydrophobic. So they are amphipathic in nature. What are they? They are amphipathic in nature. So we are going to talk about different types of proteins, different types of biomolecules individually. So here you can see lipids are amphipathic in nature. They have a polar hydrophilic region called as a head, non-polar hydrophobic region called as a tail. So overall polar could also be called as the ionic head and non-polar hydrophobic head. So overall composition is amphipathic in nature. Head is composed of glycerol 3-phosphate and tail is composed of a fatty acid. So what are fatty acids? Fatty acid, the tail of the lipids made up of fatty acids. They are non-polar tails of most membranes and attached to the polar head groups, which is glycerol 3-phosphate. It is about 50% of the fatty acids groups, and they are saturated and the difference between the saturated and unsaturated is the saturated contain no double bond. The most common saturated fatty acid groups in membrane lipids in animals are 16 to 18 carbon chains, and the half of the fatty acid molecules contain 1 or 2 double bonds. So they could be categorized as the unsaturated or the polyunsaturated fatty acids. The class of polyunsaturated or unsaturated fatty acids could be linoleic acid, arachidonic acid, and linoleic acid, depending upon the degree of unsaturation. And this degree of unsaturation determines the fluidity of the membrane. So the overall function of the fatty acid is to maintain the fluidity of the membrane. And the types which are present in case of head, it is the glycerol 3-phosphate. So here you can see the types of lipids present in the membrane. The fatty acids, if they are the unsaturated fatty acids, they could be the oleic acid. The degree of unsaturation determines the fluidity of membrane. More unsaturated fatty acids, more fluid-like membrane. Other classes contains the glycerophospholipids and the sphingolipids. Other classes also contain cholesterol as well. So when we are going to talk about the different classes of lipids, we encounter first of all the fatty acids, the glycerophospholipids, the sphingolipids, the cholesterol, and many other lipids are also present. So talking about specifically the glycerophospholipids, they are another group of major components of biomembrane. Phosphatidylethylamine is which is known as cephalin, and phosphatidylcholine, which is known as lecithin, and phosphatidylserine are among the most common types of glycerophospholipids. These are the most common types of glycerophospholipids which are present in the lipid biomembrane, and they are going to perform a huge variety of functions in the lipid membrane. In relation to the glycerophospholipids, there are different types of sphingomyelins. Sphingolipids are also present. They comprise another group of lipids found in biological membranes, especially in the tissues of the nervous system. So there are 3 types of sphingolipids: sphingomyelins, riboside, and gangliosides. They are about 6% of the membrane lipids. So as I have told you before, they are present in the tissues of the nervous system. So they made up the gray matter of the cells in the brains, which are the gangliosides, and different types are present in relation with different classes. So here we have discussed 3 classes of lipids. First we discussed the fatty acids, the classes of fatty acids, saturation and unsaturation, the glycerophospholipids, the sphingolipids, and the broad class of lipid which is also present in the membrane is the cholesterol. What is the cholesterol? Cholesterol is another common component of biomembrane of animals, but not of plants and prokaryotes. So remember, it is only present in case of eukaryotic cells, but not in case of plants and prokaryotes. It is oriented with its hydrophilic polar head. So the main function of the cholesterol is to maintain the fluidity, and its hydrophobic ring is fused and attached with the hydrocarbon group, which is buried in the interior. So cholesterol overall maintains and regulates the fluidity of the animal membrane. So talking about specifically about the lipids and the different types of lipids, we have covered all the types of different classes of lipids, and now we are going to discuss about the different types of proteins which are also present in the biomembrane. So these different types of proteins include the integral proteins, the peripheral protein, the transmembrane proteins. We will start discussing these different types of protein, and we will discuss the details of these proteins and carbohydrates in tomorrow's lecture. But the overall classification of proteins and carbohydrates includes the classes of proteins are the integral proteins, the peripheral, and the transmembrane. What is the integral protein? It is also called as intrinsic protein. These are the proteins which are present in interaction with van der Waals interaction with hydrophobic regions of the membrane. So peripheral proteins are also called as extrinsic proteins. They are bound on the surface of the membrane by ionic interaction or by hydrogen bonds with the polar heads of the membranes. They also interact with the integral membrane. They can be removed without disrupting the membrane. Other classes include the transmembrane proteins. These are also present on the surface of the protein and buried in the entire membrane of the पूरी स्ट्रक्चर मेम्ब्रेन को क्रॉस करते हैं. The hydrophobic side chains of the amino acids are embedded in the hydrophobic central core of the membrane. So these special types of transmembrane proteins serve as a receptors for hormones, the neurotransmitters, and many more specific antigens, growth factors, and many more receptors. So the three classes of proteins include integral, peripheral, and transmembrane proteins, and the carbohydrates are also present in conjugation with lipids and proteins. So these types of the different types of carbohydrates includes the glycoproteins and glycolipids and glycoproteins. These all help in the cell membrane functionality, and they are present on the outer surface, and they are involved in the different passage of receptors and the different types of message transfer. So today we discussed in detail the different types of lipids, and we discussed their functions in detail and the different classes of lipids, and we also touched the other proteins and lipids, proteins and carbohydrates also. But we will discuss the details of these proteins and carbohydrates